Hi, my name is Mandy Colleran, and I'm chairing the second half of this CPAC debate on universal basic income, solution or illusion. And I don't know about you, but I'm certainly really enjoyed the first half, and I've found everybody's arguments actually really powerful. So I'm still very much open on what I think about the idea. So maybe this second half will help for me, like for you, to clarify things, because what we're going to focus on here is actual examples of universal basic income and how they function in different parts of the world. Okay, so first of all, we'd like to welcome Bill Scott, who's the Senior Policy Advisor for Inclusion Scotland. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Mandy. Hi. And greetings from bonny Scotland, although at the moment it's kind of wet and windy up here. There was a pilot, a feasibility study set up to examine whether a basic income pilot could be run in Scotland. It had the support of 4 local authorities, Fife, North Lanarkshire, Glasgow and Edinburgh. And it also has the support of the Scottish Government, who funded the feasibility study over the course of the last 2 years. And it produced an interim report last year, and just a couple of weeks ago, it produced a final draft report. And it's recommending that pilot is set up. But in saying so, in the first few pages of the report, the authors say at this time it's not currently feasible to progress a pilot due to very complex legislative, technical and delivery challenges associated with the institutional arrangements needed for a pilot. And if these barriers are to be overcome, sustained support across all levels of government, local, Scottish and UK, for the duration of the pilot and evaluation afterwards will be needed. And this points up some of the difficulties in running a universal basic income pilot alongside an existing social security system. Because although Scotland has some devolved social security powers, they are largely in the area of disability and carers benefits, and not in the area of means-tested benefits like Job Seekers Allowance, Employment Support Allowance, and housing benefit, etc. So there's real problems in setting up a pilot, because any money that's given out to the participants in pilot studies could be clawed back either by the DWP as income, or it could also be clawed back through HMRC for those that are earning as additional income, additional taxable income for the participants. So they're huge barriers to a pilot going ahead in Scotland. I'd say the second and a very large barrier that's become an even bigger barrier because of the COVID-19 emergency is the cost of running a pilot. The estimated cost of running a pilot with about 17,000 participants across the 4 local authorities would be around £62 million per year, 186 million over 3 years. Now, that may not sound a lot of money, but that's a very small number of participants. And of those, an even smaller number will benefit from it, because there are going to be 2 rates of universal basic income in payment. There's going to be a low rate, which will be paid to the vast majority of those that are taking part. And that low rate is exactly the same as the current lower rates of Job Seekers Allowance and ESA. And it actually it's got a very perverse effect, because if you're 16 to 18-year-old, the house, or you as an individual, would actually get £84 a week. But if you're 20 to 24-year-old, you'd only get £57.90. And if you were 25 years to pension age, you'd only get just over £73. So you can tell right away that there would be no real change in the amount of money coming into the household for the vast majority of participants. A very much smaller group, about 2,500, would get a higher rate. And in those households, the rate coming in would be £213.59p a week, which is considerably more than the current level of benefits. And it's based on the minimum income standard as set by the Child Poverty Action Group. Now, again, one of the huge problems in terms of the pilot, if it ever goes ahead, and in terms of the cost, as I say, I think the COVID-19 emergency has made things much, much less likely that a pilot will take place, because if the Scottish Government is £60 million spare, then it is almost certainly going to go into poverty reduction, which would help a far, far larger number of people than would be involved in the pilots, rather than trying to see if UBI worked. But the other big issue for disabled people, and I speak as somebody that was involved in a third sector working party on this as well, is that there's very, very little understanding of the particular needs of disabled people and the rights of disabled people to be able to live independently amongst proponents of UBI in Scotland. And for a long time, myself and others raised with them some of these issues, that if universal basic income is paid at a flat rate to everybody, then disabled people would be considerably worse off than they are currently under the existing benefit system, because people on higher rates of PIP, or even on the RAG rate of Employment Support Allowance, would be worse off under the proposed levels of UBI that were being discussed. And because of that, they've decided to exclude disability benefits from the UBI pilots, which effectively means that if you're on Employment Support Allowance, you'd still be subject to conditionality, even if you were living in a pilot area. And it would also mean that you'd also have to continue to be assessed in work capability assessment, and you'd have to be assessed for personal independence payment. And I think this exemplifies some of the real problems with UBI as a concept, because it does propose a flat rate. It's not about a right-left divide on this issue. There are proponents of UBI or similar systems on the right of the political spectrum, and the Liberal Party have had it as a party policy since the 1970s. But the problem is that there's still a huge lack of understanding how it will actually impact on individuals. And because of the nature of the UBI that's being proposed, the housing costs are going to be excluded as well, because housing costs vary enormously in Scotland, as in the rest of the UK, but particularly between Edinburgh and Fife, or North Lanarkshire and Glasgow. The costs of rental, both in the private sector and the public sector, vary quite considerably. So you could not include housing costs. Childcare costs are not going to be included either. And the Scottish Government are quite generous in terms of the childcare costs that people can claim. And one of the other problems that's come up with UBI in the past, and again, would not be overcome by this, is that lone parent households would be disadvantaged, because any household with two adults would be getting considerably more income than a lone parent household would get. And that would actually mean that a considerable number of those on low income would be worse off under the UBI system than they would just claiming benefits as normal just now. Now, there are a lot of advantages to UBI in terms of dignity and respect of the people receiving the payment without any conditionality. But I think it really has to be closely looked at to see whether there are actual real advantages to people on low incomes from a universal basic income scheme. Because at the moment, the tendency is to set the universal basic income level at quite a low level. And if it's set at a much higher level, the costs become astronomical. So that the £213.59, the estimated cost to that to Scotland for everybody in Scotland to get it would be £28 billion per year. Now, to give you an idea of that, that is currently the Scottish Government's entire block grant from Westminster to run every service in Scotland, including the health service, education, social work, etc., etc. So there is no way that it could be done without raising taxes enormously in terms of income tax, and probably also value-added tax and any business rates, etc., to meet the costs of running that. And I'll stop there so that we can maybe hear some of the other examples. But there are, as I say, huge barriers to set up a UBI pilot in Scotland, far less actually roll out UBI as a system within Scotland. And some of the studies that were done here on the costs of universal basic income, the conclusion was that instead of basic income, a minimum income guarantee, which would affect all low-income households and bring them up to a certain level, would be much, much cheaper to implement and cost about £1 billion a year rather than 28 billion. And
thanks, Phil.
I'll finish there and just say that has an appeal to me, and that it would guarantee dignity and respect for people, remove conditionality, but at the same time, and reduce poverty, but without the massive costs and without some of the problems that basic income brings with it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bill. Well, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, it really points out and points up very clearly the real and genuine complexities, both financial and organisationally, that actually even implementing any kind of universal basic income, whatever style you choose it to be, would entail. So now let's go over to David Bush over in Canada. And David's the editor of Spring Magazine, and he's going to talk to us about the Canadian experience. Welcome, David.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. So yeah, I was going to just talk a little about the Ontario experience with basic income. Now, Ontario, as some of you may know, is a province in Canada that we ran a basic income pilot from 2018 to 2019. But this was not a universal basic income pilot. This was a pilot that was a means tested or targeted basic income. And it ran for a year and a half or even less. And it applied to about 4,000 individuals in the province in 4 different communities. And who was in that pilot were, of those 4,000 individuals, about 70% of those were actually working. So they weren't necessarily people who were totally outside of the labor market. And what the program did was essentially raise the level of social assistance by about 15 to 20%. So individuals in the program got about $17,000 a year, and couples got about $24,000 a year. Now, there was a top up for people with disabilities that amounted to about $500 a month, so $6,000 a year on top of that, but there was a clawback for people who were earned income, people who were working, about a 50% clawback on their wages. So the trade-off, though, was for people inside the program is that they didn't really have access to the wraparound services for people who are normally on social assistance programs, meaning that if people needed to navigate things like using money or to get a social worker to help them purchase a walker or whatever it was, that all those services were stripped. And the program didn't run the full length of its lifetime as it was set out. We had an election in Ontario that brought in a Tory government in the June of 2018. And they quickly announced that they were going to wrap up the program, and they issued the last payments in March of 2019. So it was hard to gather full data about what had happened, although some researchers have recently begun to do interviews and publish their results of those. And what we do know from that, it's not surprising, is that people who earned a higher level of, who had access to a higher level of income security, so about 15 to 20% increase from the regular social assistance rate, they were happier, they were healthier, they were feeling more secure about their finances, about their housing, and things like that. So the sum total was that people were better off. But many people might look at that and say, oh, the Ontario basic income experiment, even though it was cut short, was a success, or it pointed to a way that basic income could be successfully implemented if done right and committed to by government. But I think what people don't know as much is that the political context in Ontario was between 2013 and 2017. We had a Liberal government here that was being pushed increasingly by workers and by people who are organizing around increasing social assistance to actually bring in better wages, better working conditions in labor law, and improve social assistance, which for the last 30 years in Ontario has been under vicious attack. And so there was a whole giant campaign to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour, bring in paid sick days, bring in equal pay for equal work, to bring in protections for temp agency workers and so forth. And there was a sort of drive to increase social assistance that had been just really, really ground down by previous successive governments by both Tories and Liberals. And so one of the things that the Liberal government did was they used the basic income pilot to disorient and to disorganize forces within the working class who were trying to fight for higher social assistance and trying to fight for higher wages. And they said, let's run a program. Let's run a test. And we didn't need a test to tell us that what we needed to do was increase the existing rate of social assistance in Ontario to the level of what basic income was, to raise the rates, which would actually just catch up with the level of inflation over the last 30 years to what they were in the 1980s. And so it was one of those ways in which it was very divisive for us, and I think very disorienting for people who are fighting for higher wages. So partly because in the workers' movement, as the fight to gain an increased minimum wage to go from $11.25 to $15 gained more and more traction, the business forces like the Ontario Chamber of Commerce actually came out in support of a basic income pilot program and basic income in general, which was like, let's, instead of raising wages for workers, let's increase basic income or run another trial. And it was a delay tactic and something that was put forward to confuse and disorient. And they believed, and there was some support in the business community for the basic income, partly because it acted like a wage subsidy, so that 70% of people on the basic income who were working, essentially, instead of that money coming out from employers' pockets and profits and going into workers, this was acted as a way in which the state kind of used taxpayer money, workers' money, and workers' general funds to essentially subsidize low wage work. So these employers didn't feel any pressure to actually raise wages for these workers. And this is the whole purpose of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, pushing the basic income. And there has been, and maybe you can ask me questions as I wrap up, but there's been a renewed interest in basic income with the COVID crisis. Because the Canadian Economic Relief Benefit, which is a flat $2,000 to anyone who applies for it, so people who are unemployed and or people who are self-employed who don't have access to unemployment insurance, are able to get this CERB benefit. And people are saying this is a stepping stone to a basic income, or a version of universal basic income, that it has come under increasing vicious assault by the right wing, saying that we actually need to wrap up this program and attack it and attack workers accessing it, because they're not going into work, they're actually staying home. And so the very same dynamics that have created the conditions to attack social assistance and social welfare are also playing themselves out in any kind of version of basic income. And so the people who argue for basic income here think it's a way to do an end around the sort of very balance of class forces that has actually really ground down and attacked social assistance. And so I think, in a way, well, the sort of lessons that we draw is that social assistance needs to increase to the basic income levels, but we can't simply rely on a policy that to kind of do that work for us.
Well, thank you very much, David. That's really interesting. And again, really highlights the kind of how what looks like something really great or sounds something really great as a principle can actually be manipulated politically to serve a less than helpful agenda. Now I'd like to welcome Matt Bruening, who's joining us from the US. He's a policy analyst and founder of the People's Policy Project. And Matt's written extensively on the pilot in Finland, so which is probably the one that we've kind of all heard of. So Matt, hello.
Hi.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, so in Finland, the background in the Finnish situation is that they've been talking about basic income for decades, and the public opinion polling leading up to the basic income pilot that they did in Finland was pretty positive. Like, the majority of Finns were for it, the majority of people in the Left Alliance, the Green Party, even some of the more conservative parties were for it. And but what happened was a right-wing government got into power, a right-of-center coalition, and that was led by a gentleman named Sipilä, who was a tech CEO, which I think is interesting because it's an idea that has been somewhat popular in tech circles for various cultural reasons, it seems like. But he promised he'd do a basic income pilot if he were elected and became prime minister, and then he sort of delivered on that. What they ended up doing was not a basic income pilot in the sense that they chose, 2,000 random people throughout the country, pensioners as well as disabled people, as well as working people, as well as students. No, they didn't just take a random swath of the whole population. Instead, they took a random swath of people who were long-term unemployed, essentially. So people who've been out of the workforce for more than 400 or 500 days, and therefore were no longer eligible for earnings-related unemployment benefit. There were also some people who were selected who I believe were new labor market entrants. And so the population was essentially people who are on their basic unemployment allowance. meaning that if you're out of all your other benefits, you get this basic amount every month, which I think was 550 euros. So what they did is they took this population who was on this basic unemployment benefit, and they kind of went to them, and they sort of in a mandatory way took 2,000 of them and said, all right, guys, you're going to keep getting your money each month, but it's not going to be a basic unemployment benefit anymore. It's now going to be a basic income. The practical upshot being, if you take up work, you will not lose it. And so it became, the pilot became very narrowly focused on a very niche question, which is, if you take people who are on unemployment benefits and you tell them, hey, you can keep receiving your benefits even if you take up work, will they take up work? Right? So in a sense, it was really a test of the question, to what degree do unemployment benefits discourage work? To what degree does the fact that you lose benefits when you take up work, how much of that is keeping people out of the workforce? Which is something that basic income advocates talk a lot about. I would say basic income, one of the main emphasis over time has been that it is, in a sense, a superior unemployment benefit, because it's an unemployment benefit you don't lose when you take up work. And so in that sense, it was a relevant question, but it was not really a survey of, what would basic income look like in society generally. It was really just a question of, does this really cause people to work more or not? Are unemployment benefits keeping people out of the workforce or not? And what they found was the answer was no. The people who received the basic income money, which is, again, just to say, is the same thing as unemployment benefits, just you get to keep it if you keep working, if you take up work. Those individuals did not work more than the control group who did not receive that basic income. So in some ways, I thought that was an encouraging outcome, because from a sort of conservative perspective, you can see why they were hoping that it would show that unemployment benefits were keeping people out of work, because that might tend more towards a conclusion of, well, we got to cut unemployment benefits, or we got to do something like that in order to get people into work. And what they found is it really didn't make any difference, right? Whether you lost benefits when you took up work or whether you got to keep them when you take up work, no difference. People really did not become more employed just because they were allowed to keep their benefits if they became employed. But there was a second sort of area of analysis, which was not just do they take up work, but are they better? Do they feel better? What's the difference from them, in terms of health, in terms of subjective well-being, and that sort of thing? And that is a kind of, I think, a fascinating question, because again, these people are not receiving more income. So it's not more money. It's the same amount of money. It's just less restrictions on the money. And they didn't take up work. So what's the difference? The difference is just the rules of the program are different. But nonetheless, what they found was that the people who received the basic income reported like dramatically higher feelings of well-being. Like one specific statistic was depression. The percentage of people who said that they were depressed, and remember, these are all unemployed people where depression tends to be a little bit, more prevalent than in society generally. The percentage of people who said that they were depressed declined by 33%. So, I've never seen an intervention, medical or otherwise, where depression declines by 33%. That was just one statistic, but they had a whole battery of questions. How comfortable do you feel? Do you feel like you have power and the ability to participate in society, and so on and so forth? And in all the subjective questions, the people who got the basic income, which again, it was not more money, they felt better. And I thought that was interesting, though I don't think that by itself, what I think that actually indicates is not that basic income, quote unquote, is important, but rather that having benefits where you're not harassed all the time is important. Because that's really the difference between unemployment benefits and basic income, is if you were on unemployment benefits during this period, you've got to check in with the employment benefit office all the time. You've got various activation requirements you have to do. You've got to fill out applications. You got to keep checking in or you lose your benefits. Also during this period, the conservative government had implemented more strict activation requirements, which meant that people who are on unemployment benefits had to do various things like submit to training or, stuff like that. And the people on basic income didn't. They didn't need to check in all the time. They didn't need to, jump through all these hoops to keep their benefits. And so even though they didn't take up work, and even though their money didn't go up, their income didn't go up, the fact that they just had less stress on them, bureaucratic stress on them, seemed to make them a lot happier. So I think you can take a lesson from that, that is maybe not give everyone basic income, but is we need to create benefit systems that are not so stressful and hard on people. So yeah, I mean, that's basically all I've got on that particular plan. I mean, about basic income more generally, which is maybe not about the Finnish situation. I think the question you have to ask yourself is, what do you do about working age people who are not disabled, who are not, we're not talking about children, elderly people, disabled people. Those individuals tend to, in good systems, receive incomes. What do you do about everyone else? And the current scheme we have is, if you're in work, you get a wage. If you're not, you get an unemployment benefit. Ideally, I mean, in the US, it's a complete disaster, but in an ideal system, that's how it works. And so the question you have to ask yourself with basic income is there a better way to handle people who are working age, able-bodied, and whether they're unemployed or in work? Is there a better way to handle that than the way we have it, where you get unemployment benefits if you're unemployed, you get a wage if you're employed? Is there a better way to do that? And I don't know the answer to that question, but that to me is more the fundamental question with basic income. At least if you're committed, as I am, to saying we're not going to cut back old age pension, disability pension. We're not going to cut that back. It's really a question of unemployed people and employed people. What do we do for them? And I think the Finnish experiment at least says we should think a little bit more about this, at least especially what we do with unemployed people, and maybe be less, less sticks, more carrots, be a little bit nicer to them. And then that will make their lives a lot better.
Thanks, Matt. I think we'd all generally feel happier if all the welfare system was generally less punitive, and definitely no stick but more carrots. At this point, we've just had some comments and some questions come in. So I'm just going to read out some of the comments that we've had in. Excuse me, I've just got it on another platform. Okay. So Tony Walker says, it will never work under a neoliberal government. This is a faith-based belief. The left need to wake up. I don't want universal basic income. I will fight against it. We need progressive taxation and a different fair welfare system. The Joseph Rowntree Trust recommended minimum income for living of £17,000 with provision for sickness and disability, supported by a properly funded NHS, education, transport and housing, with rent controls and standards. That would be great. I cannot see this happening under the Tories or even the neoliberal Labour. Under them, it would be just JSA level, remove all other social provisions against a worse backdrop. It would serve as a strike fund for healthy unemployed people, and that's all. It wouldn't stop inequality per se, but get billionaires and their corporations to pay tax, remove tax havens and hedges. So basically, Tony thinks a neoliberal version would be awful. Okay, thanks, Tony. From Michael Farry, he says, let's hope universal basic income is ultimately an inevitability. It would spare us the awful system of full conditionality, which is currently what happens on universal credit, JSA equivalent. Universal basic income, could spare people of that regime, but would need to make a case for disability payments or higher rates to continue. Perhaps this is the only good thing about not having a universal basic income currently, and I think it means that we get the higher rates. Paula Peters says, for disabled people, universal basic income will not be helpful for them. It will not pay all of the costs and leave many people in poverty. Robin Sivapalan says the argument that only the worst version is possible, one where there are no disability premiums, has never made sense to me. That's like saying we could never have an NHS that was free for all, because that would inevitably mean that disabled people and others were discriminated against and would definitely be worse off. Better for everyone to pay, because that would defend provision for disabled people. And now I've got a question from Jennifer Jones for all the panelists. Do you agree that the reason why people in middle income categories are so keen on universal basic income is that they actually resent people receiving state support when, despite their relative wealth, they don't need any extra? It seems everyone wants a little bit. So, okay, panel, what do you think of Jennifer's question? Basically, it's a little bit of jealousy, I think, is what Jennifer's saying. So that they think, well, you know, everybody should get benefits then. Who'd like to answer that question first?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, in the U.S., it's not popular among anyone, certainly not middle income people. So it's a little bit of a different question here. But I do think in general, you know, there's something to universality that is attractive. And we see this, and I watched some of the first half of this meeting, and you know, people were talking about universal basic services, and those are attractive in the same way because they're universal, right? It's nice to have an NHS that everyone can go to, even if they're rich. It's nice to have schools everyone can go to, even if they're rich. So I think that can be appealing, and you shouldn't treat that bad. You shouldn't kind of be like, look at these people, they want money, they don't need it. You want to kind of incorporate that feeling a little bit, because to build a welfare state, you need some sense of solidarity, some sense we're all benefiting, we're all contributing, we're all in this together. This might not be the best way to accomplish that, but that impulse is not necessarily bad, and we want to work around that impulse and make people feel like they're invested in the system.
I think that's right, Matt, absolutely. Dave, would you like to add any comments? David?
Oh, sure. Yeah. In terms of, I find talking about basic income and sort of polling about basic income here is very difficult, partly because it's such an elastic term and can mean so much to so many different people. Are we talking about a universal basic income? Are we talking about our pilot project? Are we talking about targeted? If we're talking about a universal basic income, what amount are you talking about? Because some people, you talk about it and it's like, oh, we'll get every person will get $30,000 a year or something, and then we'll have a negative income tax. And then you get into the question, is like, well, okay, what the cost of that is insanely prohibitive. If you actually do the numbers in Ontario or Canada, you're talking about virtually doubling our budget to achieve that, maybe a little more. But basic income as a concept does have appeal. So polling that it's pretty sympathetic here in Ontario and in Canada. Interestingly enough, during the height of the debate about basic income a couple of years ago, it was small and medium enterprise businesses, like if you went down, like people who were owners of those businesses, that had the highest level of support, partly because they knew that this, if it ever came in, would be an entire wage subsidy to them. Essentially, it would act as a deferment for actually increasing wages, like on their front, and that would actually bounce it back into general funds from the government. So they understood that, I think from a class position, it would benefit them. But I think as Matt was saying, the instinct of like supporting a basic income is not a bad instinct. I don't think it's the right policy, but the idea that people shouldn't live in poverty, shouldn't be harassed I think that's good. Like,
Yes.
obviously, I think that we should be supporting that, but thinking about how do we channel that into accomplishing the goal.
Thank you. Bill, would you like to come in on that briefly? So I've got one other question before we go to Mark, who's going to close the evening for us.
Yeah, I think I very much agree with Matt and David on this. I think there should be a universal right to a minimum income that gives everybody a decent standard of living. But that's a different thing from a universal basic income where you give the money to everybody. You should raise up everybody below a certain standard up to that standard. And I think that would be a way forward that would provide decency, etc. Because I think that universal basic income's been sold to disabled people as a way of getting rid of conditionality and assessments. And it's not that, because even the pilot study in Scotland is basically saying that disability benefits would have to remain in place and assessments for disability benefits would have to remain in place. So if we're fighting for basic income, we would still have to fight against conditionality. We'd still have to fight for a fairer assessment regime. So I see it as a bit of distraction, actually, for the fight that's in the here and now, because we've got a very unfair assessment system and a very unfair conditionality where disabled people are 2 or 3 times more likely to be sanctioned on job seekers allowance and employment support allowance than non-disabled people. That is completely wrong. And it's the conditionality that's the problem, and make people think that universal basic income is the solution. And I don't think it is.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, it points to the difference actually between the notion of universality and actually equity, which are very different things. And I think you've outlined that really clearly, Bill. I think I'd certainly agree with you. Got one last question that's coming from David, and I think probably it would go to Matt and David again. He asks, has the acceleration towards workplace automation and technological unemployment been factored in to UBI and BI pilots and studies? So Matt or David? Has the acceleration towards workplace automation and technological unemployment been factored in to universal basic income pilots and?
Well, I mean, in the Finnish one, it only went to people who are unemployed and receiving basic unemployment benefits. Those were not people, they didn't pick people who are only unemployed because of increases in automation or anything like that. So I don't know why that would be different. Why, if you're unemployed for one reason or another, it's probably the same kind of experience. Maybe it might be a little bit different if your whole region depends upon a certain kind of employment that now no longer exists. But so I haven't seen anyone take that into account per se. But most of the, even I think that the Dutch one, the kind of shortcut on these experiments is they tend to focus on the unemployed. And so to the extent that picks some of that up, I guess it is incorporated.
Yeah, it's in Ontario, it wasn't explicitly incorporated, although they chose 4 different communities. One of them was Hamilton, which is like our steel town, which has seen a real attack on that industry and the diminishing of traditional steel jobs. But it wasn't necessarily incorporated in this specific study or in even the sort of questions like the research that has gone on since. But I would probably push back a little about like technological unemployment is a regular feature of capitalism. I'm not entirely sold that it's like somehow on an accelerationist curve. If we look at the rate of productivity growth in the last 10 years, it's lower than the rate of productivity growth in the last several decades before that. And so I do question whether like that overarching kind of narrative, like how true that is. Not to say that people aren't being displaced by technology, but I'm not convinced, at least in Ontario and Canada, that that's something that has increased in the last several years, as opposed to probably actually grown at a slower rate.
Can I say something on this, Mandy? Because it was built into the pilot studies in Scotland in terms of the feasibility report anyway, because there was an understanding or an expectation that jobs are going to be lost in retail and office jobs because of the increased automation. I mean, you can see it happening in retail already. With self-service checkouts increasingly dominating the big supermarkets. So there is going to be some fallout in terms of unemployment due to automation. Like David, I don't know what the scale of that will be, but it has meant that some people, billionaires like Elon Musk and Richard Branson, are favouring a universal basic income so that people will have money to continue to buy their products, even if they're unemployed. So, that's why I was saying earlier that, the proponents of UBI just aren't to be found on the left. There are quite a number of them on the right as well, and for their own reasons. And it is about consumerism and having a market still for the products that you produce when fewer people are in employment.
Okay, thanks, guys. And now I'm going to hand over basically to Mark Junk, who's going to sum up the evening, close the meeting. Mark's a long-standing member of DPAC, and he's going to announce DPAC's Day of Online Action against the reintroduction of conditionality and sanctions. Okay, Mark, hi.
Hi, thanks, Mandy, and thanks to all the speakers tonight. I'll try not to go on too long because I think we've had a long and productive discussion, really, centred around the question of whether we should support a universal basic income tonight. I just want to address a few of the questions that have been raised and the points and stuff before I close the meeting. And I want to start really with a point of unity, because what's absolutely clear from everyone in the meeting tonight, whether you're in favour of a universal basic income or not, is that the driving factor for that on the left in general, but also specifically, I think, in the disabled people's movement for very good reason, is the idea of getting rid of conditionality. I think this is driving the popularity of the universal basic income, and it's something that comes up time and time again in the advocates for it. It's something we absolutely want to do. We don't want anyone going through sort of humiliating tests that we've experienced for years, and the horrific results of those testing regimes, which I'm sure people are all too familiar with. But the fly in the ointment for me when it comes to conditionality being used really as a justification for support for a universal basic income is the fact that the very sort of things I've just talked about are presented as a reason for supporting universal basic income. But when we as disabled people press the advocates of universal basic income for any detail on this, we get the sort of response that I think was clear in what Bill was saying about the pilots in Scotland, that, oh, well, disability is going to be excluded from it. That's something else. Housing, the biggest cost for any working class person, whether disabled or not, is excluded from it. Now, these are all things that are subject to means testing, and so the idea of conditionality is implicit in them. So on the one hand, advocates of UBI say we want to get rid of conditionality, but for disabled people and anyone who needs support with their housing costs, really, what's presented to us is a situation in which that conditionality remains, in which it's separated off from support for anyone who doesn't need those things. And therefore, I think the claims that this is something that's going to get rid of stigma are seriously problematic. In addition to that, I think there's real potential for further attacks on support that is absolutely reliant for us. I think people on both sides of the argument have talked about our demands for a national independent living service tonight. and I do think we have to be wary of the idea of a UBI being an expenditure in terms of the thinking of the state, even from those on the left, and that these things could come into direct competition, and that things like a nil's really a progressive demand that fits the sort of category of the things that Grace was talking about in terms of basic service provision, things that we need and that are withdrawn from this sphere of commodities that we pay for as atomised individuals. A really brilliant demand that fulfills those sort of goals could come under threat. I mean, I'll just refer back to something that Ellen spoke about at the start of the meeting, which is a quote that comes from Guy Standing, who prepared a report for John McDonnell when he was the Shadow Chancellor. And this is the quote where he's talking about providing care, and says that basic income can be seen as a means of inducing people to spend more time doing care work. A basic income would enable more people to spend more time caring for those they love, incidentally reducing pressure on the Treasury to pay for public and private carers. In considering the net cost of a basic income, this expected saving should be factored into the calculation. So it's absolutely there in black and white in the report that Guy Standing prepared. That UBI is seen as something that means that you can pick and choose bits and support, and that it should be seen in opposition, really, to the idea of the state providing direct provision for social support that we are so reliant on, something that pushes disabled people further away from the conception of a universal basic income, and I think reinforces the fact that we're correct to raise these criticisms and concerns over it. So I think what we need to do is focus on where we're united and realise that those demands can be decoupled from the idea of a UBI. We can campaign against conditionality in the current system without relying on this being part of a system that implies that some of the problems of conditionality are brought back. If a UBI implies that conditionality around being provision for disability remains, then why not cut to the chase and we'll just campaign and build public support for the idea that we get rid of this sort of conditionality once and for all because it's wrong, rather than going around the houses. I think it's right that Bill says it's a distraction from the immediacy of things that we should be going after now. And I think that's right, why we're really calling our focus at the moment as DPAC is to take on the question of universal credit and trying to tackle the real things that are a massive problem. As well, with millions of people, including myself, look like we're going to be thrown on the scrap heap once again. Huge millions of people being forced to rely on universal credit and that system of work conditionality and all the rest. We need to really get together and build a mass movement around this. The solution to this isn't something that we can sit back and debate and wait for it to be delivered from above. We need to get out on the streets and actually start getting campaigning around. And while at the moment with coronavirus, it's not easy for us to get out on the streets, we want to start that process with our online day of action, which we've called for this Wednesday, the 1st of July. And I'd encourage everyone to go onto the DPAC website, dpac.uk.net, to check out what we're calling for people to do. We really want to get the message out there that we shouldn't be seeing the return of sanctions. Work for the idea that the government is talking about putting more people in poverty, driving more people towards destitution because they can't prove that they're looking for jobs that don't exist, is an absolute absurdity. It's unsafe for people to be going back to the job centres, but the return of sanctions implies that they're looking at some point in the near future to reopen those and put people in those confined quarters and potentially spread the virus. We need to resist all of this. So we're asking people to join that day of action this Wednesday, and I hope people will do so. I hope people have found tonight's meeting useful in clarifying ideas around universal credit and universal basic income. And I hope you'll get engaged with Deepak's campaigning going forwards. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And really, I've just come back to say thanks everyone for tuning in. I would like to thank our speakers, Paul Collins, Ellen Morrison, Simone Apsis, Mandy Hudson, Grace Blakely, Bill Scott, David Bush, and Matt Browning, and of course Mark. And also to say thank you very much to Nikki and Sam, our sign language interpreters. Thanks to Ellen Clifford for being my sidekick in co-chairing, and also thanks to Nathan for the backroom technical support. And we hope to see you all on, in virtual terms on the 1st of July. Thank you, and good night, everyone.